I often wonder what would have happened if SpongeBob got cancelled in 2004, which was the definitive first time that could have and should have reasonably happened. Maybe then we wouldn't have to look back at the show with as many asterisks as we do now. Now it's a show that started good, got bad, then got good again, and now it's getting bad again. I hate that it has to be this way because, as much of an American cultural icon as SpongeBob is, the show that spawned him has way too many bad eras to be considered good in aggregate. But it could also be argued that part of the reason it is so much of a cultural icon is because of how long it's gone on. At this point, it's up there with The Simpsons as being a show that is just known to never end under any circumstances. The thing is, though, now in this bad era, I'm not sure there's any hope for SpongeBob to ever be a good show again, because the problems with the latest seasons of the show are pervasive to the point that it seems like they're trying to erase the identity of the show. Ironically, I've chosen to illustrate this by talking about an episode of the show that I believe is middle of the road. Why have I done this? Because they made a sequel to Idiot Box, and frankly that's just a fruit that hangs way too low. Besides, the episode I'm talking about in this episode, that's a weird way to put it, actually did something groundbreaking, and didn't just pretend to do something groundbreaking. There's something to be said that Bassword is the first SpongeBob episode where SpongeBob himself doesn't make an appearance. I like that they don't feel like they have to include the main character in every episode, though as we go through this review, you'll see why this is a symptom of a larger issue. I mean, in Mall Girl Pearl, SpongeBob gets a line in at the very end of the episode, but in this one, he's not present at all, and there wasn't really any time where I thought, this episode would be better if SpongeBob was in it. This is because the pairing of Bubble Bass and Squidward is actually a decent one, and it's a shame we haven't seen much up to this point. Though, there are certain contrivances that do make it seem a bit forced. Just tell him to move over! But I digress. Overall, I'd say it was good, but it was not a great attempt at this pairing. It doesn't really feel like SpongeBob anymore, and it's not because SpongeBob isn't in this episode. No SpongeBob episode past maybe season 10 or 11 really does feel like a SpongeBob episode. This is a hard pill to swallow, and I'm sure there's going to be some SpongeBob fans in the comments that have a problem with that assessment. SpongeBob the show is in a bit of an identity crisis. It's not off base to say that. I mean, the person that wrote Bassword's last writing credit was Good Neighbors, which wasn't a good omen for this episode. And when you see the decisions the production people made, it's not hard to draw the conclusion that they're trying to fundamentally shift the style and tone of the show in a derivative manner. Bassword isn't a very funny episode. The witty verbal humor that made SpongeBob a famous show has been replaced with slapstick, and for the most part, slapstick done badly. Some episodes from seasons 12 through 14 just feel like Ren and Stimpy episodes done with SpongeBob characters. Or, excuse me, Ren and Stimpy slapstick actually worked because the characters reacted to the pain they experienced, which is the only way slapstick actually does work. Some of these episodes feel like Schnookums and Meat, which was Disney's phony attempt at copying Ren and Stimpy, to little success. My theory on how this happened is that some people behind the scenes of Ren and Stimpy got on the production crew and started using their influence to change the types of visual jokes told. This is all fine and good in principle, after all. Shows change and evolve all the time and can even improve if this process is done properly. Ren and Stimpy has its own influences it drew from, such as classic Looney Tunes cartoons. And that is where I believe SpongeBob as a show is today. Since it's grown so much as an icon of American cartoon culture as a whole, it only makes sense to go back to the original iconic cartoon and draw influence. SpongeBob is not a show that doesn't have to create its own stories from a singular character's perspective, like what was perhaps the case early on. Oftentimes, Looney Tunes shorts would just be about random characters, because who the slapstick happens to isn't as important as whose expense the verbal joke is at. Since modern SpongeBob is more slapstick heavy, this is the direction they can take the show. This is probably why it made sense to leave SpongeBob out of an episode only just now. It should also be noted that since SpongeBob's tone has shifted this much, it makes much more sense to cut it up into chunks that divide the show up, rather than to treat it as one show. I mean, The Simpsons and Futurama have much more in common with each other than season 13 and 14 SpongeBob have with the first 3 seasons. For die-hard fans, this might be another tough pill to swallow, but it is something I genuinely believe is true. It doesn't make sense to review it as if it's the same show when we first watched it. Fast-forward as an episode is proof of this. You might be a bit bothered to not see me review this episode plot point by plot point, but honestly, the story of this episode is rather light, as are a lot of the ones in the more recent seasons. I think it's exemplary of the direction SpongeBob is going as a show. Very few jokes land for the aforementioned reasons, and it's because of this that I think the derivation of the aforementioned influences, such as classic Looney Tunes and Ren and Stimpy, are even less excusable. It's one thing to be inspired by a previous work, but then to be inspired by that previous work and be a worse version of it isn't really a good thing. It's kind of funny, I compared modern SpongeBob to classic Looney Tunes, but modern Looney Tunes, i.e. Duck Dodgers, a Looney Tunes show, etc., actually does SpongeBob's previous shtick of clever verbal humor very well. It's almost as if SpongeBob and the Looney Tunes have swapped places in the modern contemporary culture. One thing you may have noticed is that the title of Bassword itself is self-referential to what it was trying to accomplish. Most of the time, if SpongeBob wants to use a character pairing they've never used before, it comes naturally through other events. This episode, like classic Looney Tunes, just starts out with the character pairing, as if to say it's the entire point of the story. Chum Fricassee wasn't called Plankword, for example, and they spent a few of those precious 11 minutes actually establishing the setup for the story. Chum Fricassee, by the way, an episode which is from the era in which a lot of fans consider to be the bad era of the show. That setup just doesn't happen anymore, because just like in classic Looney Tunes short, the setup can be anything, as the characters are malleable to many different situations. This didn't happen before because the show wasn't seen this way before. Again, none of these things are really bad per se, but they are bad when there's a misunderstanding of why they worked in the first place. SpongeBob is a show that painstakingly established its world building, specifically so its original forms of humor would land better. Shoving Looney Tunes style humor and episode structure into SpongeBob is like shoving a square peg into a circle hole. Maybe when I figure out a unique angle, I'll talk about Squidiot Box on this channel, but for now, thanks for watching everyone, and have a good one.